Shalom everyone, and welcome to Reboot the Root. In this series of teachings, we're going to be looking at the story of Hanukkah. In fact, we're going to be rebooting the story of Hanukkah, giving us an educated understanding of what Hanukkah is through the book of 1st Macabees. So join me, if you will, as we reboot the root and reboot the story of Hanukkah. Shalom. Shalom and welcome to this episode of Reboot the Root. This is episode 6 of our reboot of the story of Hanukkah. So continuing on from episode 5, we are diving deeper and deeper into the historical account of the Macabees revolt against the Greek Seleucids. So last episode I left you talking about that the Jews had retreated into the hills, and they were making their intentions known about that they were not going to be given in to the pagan invasion of Jerusalem and the temple and of their nation. So they have decided to revolt against the Greeks. And so let's go back a little bit into one of the verses of 1st Macabees chapter 2, where we will kind of go back a little bit and then go forward some more with our story. So last episode, the last scripture, or not scripture, the last reference in 1st Maccabees, we were in chapter 2, verses 28 through 30, and we'll reread that and continue on. So it says, "So he and his sons fled into the mountain and left all that ever they had in the city." They left everything behind. Then many that sought after justice and judgment went down into the wilderness to dwell there. So their hearts were filled with, they wanted what was right to happen. They were willing to fight for it. Both they and their children and their wives and their cattle, because afflictions increased sore upon them. So the atrocities that they were being subjected to by the Greeks, they were not willing to be a party of them anymore. So they took their whole families and their possessions and they left. And so those who decided to retreat, these people are the ones who sought justice. Matthias retreated with his 5 sons into the hills, and many others who were seeking righteousness and were concerned about the response of Antiochus went to live in the wilderness. And this comes from BibleWise.com in their article about the Apocrypha 1st Maccabees. So let's recap what they say. It says that those who retreated sought justice, and Matthias retreated with his 5 sons, and many others who were seeking righteousness went to live in the wilderness. Again, that comes from BibleWise.com. So the Jews who refused the pagan invasion, they refused by retreating to fight. You've heard of the saying that says, those who retreat live to fight another day. So their battle plan at this time was to gather your forces and make a battle plan. 1 Maccabees chapter 2 verses 32 through 34 says, "They pursued after them a great number, and having overtaken them, they camped against them and made war against them on the Sabbath day. And they said unto them, Let that which you have done hitherto suffice. Come forth and do according to the commandment of the king, and you shall live." So the people, the Greeks are coming after those that retreated. They're making an offer to them. They're saying, and if you will come back and do what the king says, you will live. But their answer to them, as it was before, they said, "We will not come forth, neither will we do the king's commandment to profane the Sabbath day." So they are sticking to their guns. They are saying, "We will not come down. We will not give in to you. We will resist you." Those who fled to resist the Greeks fled to the Judean mountains, and they resisted the Greeks who wanted to have them paganized. So when we say they were going to be Hellenized, it's kind of a light idea to say we're going to make you like Greeks. It was more than that. They were wanting them to be paganized, to be totally transformed spiritually, as well as far as not just to say that we want you to go do things our way. That's really the light way of putting it. They're saying, really, we want you to be like us. We want you to be pagan like us. We want you to go against your God. We want you to go against your laws, against your religion, and come and do it like we want you to do. So they are trying to fit the Jews into their little box that they can control. So what happened here in this last verse with 1 Maccabees 2:32 through 34, we're seeing that the Greeks are compelling them to fight on the Sabbath day, but the Jews respond by saying, "Neither will we do the king's commandment to profane the Sabbath day." So they will not fight on the Sabbath day. So they're going back. The Greeks had compelled them to fight on the Sabbath, and they're going back to the start. The Greeks wanted Matthias, possibly the high priest, to be the first to set aside the covenant, and then the rest would follow. So this whole thing started when Matthias refuses to do what the king Antiochus decreed him to do. So the Greeks wanted Matthias to set aside the covenant. So their idea is if we can get him, possibly the high priest, to actually give in, the others will fall in. So a good military tactic is this, is to say if we can get the leader, if we can bring the leader down, all the people will follow. And so I think this is what their battle tactic against the rebels is to get the leader to toe the line, and the others will soon follow. 1 Maccabees 2:18 says, "Now therefore come thou first and fulfill the king's commandment, like as all the heathen have done." So this is the spirit of the idea of the Greeks to break the Jews is they want them to fulfill the king's commandment, to be like heathens. So it's not like they're trying to cover up their intentions. They're making it well known. We want you to be heathenistic as well, like we are. And so they're asking Matthias to be the first one to come forth, be the example, and all the others will follow. 1 Maccabees 2:33 says, "And they said unto them, Let that which you have done hitherto suffice. Come forth and do according to the commandment of the king, and you shall live." So the Jews have retreated to fight, but the Greeks have ensued after them to say, "Come and do the commandment of the king, and you shall live." So Any battle tactic, I think, would say, let's do things the easy way rather than the hard way. You will lose less men if you can get your enemy to succumb to your will without having to use force. So I think this is what is happening here, is that they would rather them come and give in to the king's law and do what they want them to do rather than oppose the rebels in battle. The Greeks, we find that the Greeks wanted them to surrender first rather than to have to engage them in battle. The Israelite rebels, they refused to surrender. So what we're seeing here, what we're seeing happening here, is the Greeks wanted assimilation, but the Israelite rebels refused to be assimilated. They refused to comply to the will of the king. The Greeks choose to fight on the Sabbath. And why would they choose to meet the Jews on the Sabbath? Because I think they're counting on that the Jews won't fight on the Sabbath. Maybe it'll be an easy takeover. Maybe they can take them a little more easier if they say, let's go fight them on their holy day. So the Greeks, they choose the Sabbath day to engage the Jewish rebels. The Israelite rebels would not fight on the Sabbath, nor would they surrender. And they say with a very bold statement, we will not do the king's commandment. 1 Macabees 2, 37 through 38. But said, let us all die in our innocency. Heaven and earth will testify for us that ye put us to death wrongfully. So they rose up against them in battle on the Sabbath, and they slew them with their wives and children and their cattle, to the number of 1,000 people. So the Greeks, they decided to engage them on the Sabbath anyway, despite that they would not engage them in battle on the Sabbath day. 1 Maccabees 2, 40 through 41. And one of them said to another, if we all do as our brethren have done, and fight not for our lives and laws against the heathen, they will now quickly root us out of the earth. At that time, therefore, they decreed, saying, whosoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against them. Neither will we die all as our brethren that were murdered in the secret places. So they do decide ultimately, after all, that they will engage the pagan army on the Sabbath day, saying, whosoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against them. So the Jewish rebels, they had to consider the cost, count the cost, if you will. They had to consider that the Greeks slew 1,000 of the rebels during that time. The Israelites who survived on the Sabbath battle, the Israelites who survived, they considered the thought, fight not for our lives and laws. They stood up for life and the Torah, the law, and they had a resistance against heathenism. And we've already discussed, to be a heathen is to be pagan. They took a stand against tyranny, oppression, and paganism in their defense of the Torah. And so we have to entertain this idea that sometimes peace requires war. Sometimes freedom is not free. Sometimes to have our freedoms and peace, there must be a consideration of the cost. And first, going back, when in 1 Maccabees chapter 2 verse 40, they had to consider if they would fight on the Sabbath day or not. They had to say, they had to not say, but they had to understand that there was a real possibility that they would quickly root them out of the earth, as it says in 1 Maccabees 2 verse 40. They had considered their extermination. They said in 1 Maccabees 2:41, we will fight against him, neither will we die all as our brethren that were murdered. Because before, they chose not to fight because of the Sabbath. But after the slaughter of their brethren, the Israelite rebels considered the costs and chose to fight the Greek army on that Sabbath day. So their heart was this: they refused to die without a fight. 1 Macabees chapter 2, 42 through 44. Then came there unto him a company of Assyrians, who were mighty men of Israel, even all such as were voluntarily devoted unto the law. Also all that fled for persecution joined themselves unto them, and were a stay unto them. So they joined their forces and smote sinful men in their anger and wicked men in their wrath, but the rest fled to the heathen for succor. So highlighting 1 Maccabees 2:42, we see that it says, Then came there unto him a company of Assyrians, who were mighty men of Israel, even all such as were voluntarily devoted unto the law. And so we need to take a look at who these Assyrians were. So the Assyrians in Hebrew are called the Hasidim, or also known as saints in Greek. The Greek word would be the Assyrioi. So these were the Assyrians. They were saints, that men who were endowed with grace. These were Assyrians, became allies or help unto the Jewish rebels. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, these Assyrians were the saints that were endowed with grace, and they were maintainers of the Mosaic law against the invasion of Greek customs. When the Maccabees struggled against Antiochus IV, the Assyrians naturally joined their cause. So these Assyrians, they're like allies to the Maccabees. In the Free Dictionary, it says that these Hasidim, these Assyrians, they were a sect of Orthodox Jews that rose out of a pietistic movement originating in Eastern Europe in the second half of the 18th century. A sect that follows the Mosaic laws strictly. So these Assyrians, I would think that they are like the ancestors of the Hasidim, the Orthodox Jews that would rise up in the 18th century. And so we still see the Hasidim sect of Jews. A lot of them, there's a lot of them in New York City, and probably in all the major metropolitan areas of the United States, as well as metropolitan areas in Europe as well. Persecuted Israelites took opportunity of the newly found rebellion to side with the effort to repel the Greeks. So oftentimes in war, we see other groups of people who don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. They see an opportunity to get rid of a common foe. So this may have been what was happening with the Assyrians, that they say, well, you know what, maybe they thought, well, we can't really get rid of them alone, but we see another group of people who are at war. Let's join with them so we can get rid of a common enemy. So the rebels were incited to rebel because of their persecution, and smote sinful men in their anger and wicked men in their wrath, as we read about in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 42 through 44. And so the rebels were incited to rebel because of their persecution. Other Israelites were not so incited and chose to find refuge back among the Greeks. So they saw the fight was too much for them, so they decided to go back to being Hellenized. 1 Maccabees chapter 2, 45 through 48. Then Matthias and his friends went round about and pulled down the altars. These are the altars of the pagans. And what children soever they found within the coast of Israel uncircumcised, those they circumcised valiantly. They pursued also after the proud men, and the work prospered in their hand. So they recovered the law out of the hand of the Gentiles and out of the hand of the king, out of kings. Neither suffered they the sinner to triumph. So this kind of goes back to what we have in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 2 or 3, which there is a Torah law to take down the pagan altar. So let's read that. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. You shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which you shall possess serve their gods, upon the high mountains and upon the hills, and under every green tree. And you shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire. And you shall hew down the graven image of their gods and destroy the names of them out of their place. So what these Maccabean rebels are doing is they're actually following the Torah to take down the altars, as it says in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 45, where it says, Matthias and his friends went round about and pulled down the altars. So they recovered the law out of the hand of the Gentiles. So these Gentiles are the pagans. And so we have to understand that the temple had been robbed of the Torah. The temple had the Torah scroll in it. So if you know anything about synagogues, even Messianic synagogues, Messianic congregations will have their own Torah scroll. So when you go to a Jewish synagogue and on the Sabbath day, the rabbi or synagogue leaders will read the Torah from the Torah scroll. So every Jewish synagogue and some Messianic congregations or Messianic synagogues will have their own Torah scroll to read from. So when the pagans had come in, one of the things they probably did was they came in and they took the law, the Torah, out of the temple. And so we have to understand that this was an act of Gentiles. And so Gentiles are non-Israelites. They are people who are non-Christians, and they're also non-believers. So these pagan invaders, they are definitely Gentiles. So the law that they came to take out of the temple by these Gentiles, by these non-Israelites, they would be coming here to take God's Torah, which is God's law. And then what would happen is that these rebels would also come and find that these Israelites who would not become circumcised, they forced them to be circumcised. They did it probably against their will. So these Hellenized Greek Israelites were forced to be circumcised because they were obeying the king's commandment to be uncircumcised. So let's kind of veer away from the Maccabees book for a moment to kind of further this idea about how the Maccabee rebels, they recovered the law out of the hand of the Gentiles. We're going to go to 2 Kings chapter 22, verses 8 through 13. And it says that I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. 2 Kings describes the terrible wickedness and idolatry with King Manasseh, idolatry that King Manasseh led his people to. He ruled for 55 years, followed by his son Amon for another 2. Then in chapter 22, 10 years into the reign of his grandson King Josiah, the high priest found a Torah scroll, and they were not even familiar with its contents. The king repented and led the nation to a great religious revival. And this exemplifies what I just read. I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And so this comes from this commentary I just read you, came from aish.com, and its article, Torah Rediscovery in Josiah's time. So this is kind of points to that there comes a time when there's great excitement, great rejoicing that we have recovered the Torah, that we have found the Torah once again when it's been kept from us. There's a great excitement and joy that we find that when we find God's law and we find that it's being returned to us. So going back to 1 Macabees chapter 2, 49, it says, now 49 through 51 actually. Now when the time drew near that Matthias should die, he said unto his sons, now hath pride and rebuke gotten strength, and the time of destruction, and the wrath of indignation. Now therefore, my sons, be ye zealous for the law, and give your lives for the covenant of your fathers. Call to remembrance what acts our fathers did in their time, so you shall receive great honor and an everlasting name. So in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 52 through 60, Matthias recounts the acts of the fathers of Israel. So these fathers of Israel would be Abraham, would be Joseph, Phineas and the high priest, Joshua and Caleb, David, Elijah, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. These names are also commonly known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. And 1 Maccabees 2:51 says, call to remembrance what acts our fathers did in their time. Hanukkah reminds us of the struggle that the Maccabees faced, and they in turn are reminded of the struggle before them. So an interesting thing happens that's provoked in this statement is that we too can also remember the acts of those who've gone before us. Some people in Christian history, people who have suffered great harm, great risk to their lives. Some people, many of them died, many were tortured, many of them were oppressed. Many people who came before us that fought for the things that we have today, we should take time to remember the fight that they did. And this kind of is the heart of Hanukkah, is to remember the fight that was done before us. We remember the revolt of the Maccabees that drove out the Greek invaders, so that we could move on to what we have for today. So one revolt adds on to another, which adds on to another, which adds on to another. It's the struggle that we remember, are reminded of, that recounts even back to the Exodus story. We're reminded how Yahweh delivered us as a people from our bondage, and the remembrance continues. Speaking of continue, we're going to have to continue into the next episode, episode 7, where we'll continue the reboot of Hanukkah. So for now, say shalom, invite you back as we continue the reboot of Hanukkah. Shalom.